Anuradho me bhava sarva siddhi me jayasa sarva kama susa me siddham shriya guru aho bhagavan sarva tata gata bhaja mame bhaja bhaje bhava mahasamaya sadhu Om Benza Sato Samaya Manu Balaya Benza Sato Sanopa Tita Tito Me Bhava Sada.
Hello audience, hello my friends, hello my students and fellow scholars of literary theory. In our previous lectures, we had precisely seen a focus on language as exercised by the structuralists and post-structuralists, and from that model of understanding how language is, how it operates, what it does and what it doesn't, in terms of breaking language in parts of units, that is structural units, and looking at the relationship between the structural units from the barest level to very sophisticated levels, such as the chaotization of the indeterminacy between a word and its meaning, or between a signifier and its possible anchorage into signifieds amid slippage. We have basically understood that anything in this world can be comprehended through that viable model of language that the structuralists and the post-structuralists were positing in their own way. Today we are going to look into a theorist who definitely had arguments on the structuralist and post-structuralist positions and postulates related to language and its operation, but also talked about the structural analysis of extralinguistic elements of our reality, such as the structure of our ethical life or the structure of our cognitive life. We are going to talk on Paul Ricouer, and we are going to concentrate in this lecture on the structure of man's, that is humans, ethical and cognitive reality. Now, according to structuralism, everything has a structure, however chaotic or anarchic that structure may be. Even that anarchy has some kind of a structure which may not be rigid, but the precise absence of its rigidness is its structural hallmark. By that logic, man as a character, or the human being as a character, should also have structures or readiness to be understood as structure. By that logic, man's cognitive duration on earth and man's ethical and psychological cognitions should also have a structure. That structure may not be rigid, that structure may not be homogeneous, or that structure may not be monolithic. Nevertheless, it can be made into a blueprint. Man's pathetic of misery, according to Ricouer, is that as a structure, man is finite. By finitude, Ricouer wanted to mean two things. First and foremost, that man's cognitive duration is finite and far less than his total time on earth, that is, the existential duration of man, is so greater than the cognitive duration of man, that the cognitive duration of man, his thinking, his emotions, his affects, his psychological operations, his meditations, his imaginations, his fear, his desire, etc. If you have a structure of all of these around that particular individual called that particular man, you would see that it is far less than his existential duration on earth. This is according to Ricouer, a relative finitude, that is the structural quality of man's cognitive existence on earth. Secondly, man as a character, or man as man, is never free from its relational tussle, dependence, interaction, and opposition, from what the man is not, from its others. According to Ricouer, my birth is an event for others, not for myself. For example, the experience of birth is definitely mine, but a baby's birth is an experience that is far more registered in the cognitive processes of the others who are witnessing or who are celebrating that baby's birth. And the baby, whatever the experience, would either forget or repress that particular event. So the baby's birth is structurally outside the cognitive life of the baby, and whatever is registered in the name of the baby's birth for every baby, which means for every human being, is actually an event for others' cognitive structures who witnessed or celebrated the baby's birth. So if we want to see our life as a whole or total structure, then we have to, right from the moment of birth, and probably till the moment of death and even after, we have to adapt the perspective or point of view of others. That is the first moment of fragility for man, because his life as a structure is hugely present in others. That means it is hugely absent in the structure of the self. Although it is the life of the self, a large part of it is outside the cognitive structure of the self. This fragility, or let's call it this absence, can only be filled up by something called imagination. And that imagination would involve, definitely, if we can freely mix from one theory's postulates to another theory's postulates to make as some kind of a working formula, definitely it would involve Freud's Oedipal circuit and the 5 phases, and definitely it would involve Lacan's postulates related to the mirror stage. All of these are definitely part of imagination, and when Coleridge was talking about primary imagination, which is the infinite recurrence of the affirmation I am, that is primary imagination. And now we understand why Coleridge called it imagination and not reality, because the self's cognitive structure from the moment of birth to the moment of death is largely absent from the self's cognitive structures, although it is about a particular character, but the character does not retain or possess the events in it. The events are rather possessed in the memory, in the experience, in the cognitive structures of others who witnessed it or who negotiated that particular event. There is another reason for which Ricouer used to call the structure of man as finite, and that is, man, as it is narrated and expressed in the human culture, is structured as a character. For example, Oedipus is a character, or in a historical novel, a king who really lived becomes a character. Each human being has narratives to pass, and each human being negotiates these narratives as protagonists or characters. This conversion is very, very tricky because apparently it's very transparent, direct, and coextensive. But actually, only that structural part of the man is retained within the structure called character, which is registered in the cognitive structures. So that would mean that there is a dissipation or loss, just like when you are passing electricity through a circuit of your house, there is dissipation of energy. In the same way, there is dissipation of man, large parts of that unstructured man when he is structured into a character. Character is inescapable. The process of changing oneself still would stem from the self. So the character is part of one's structural finitude. Humanity is the possibility of the infinite. The essential infinite community of each individual is humanity, but that is unstructured. When it is structured into Mr. Jones or Mrs. Joseph, or Mrs. Taylor, or Miss Anderson, or Dr. Aziz, or James Joyce, or T.S. Eliot, that infinite possibility called humanity is now structured within finiteness or finitude of the character. So whenever this unstructured existential human is notionalized and conceptualized on a cultural or social platform, he is converted into a character. And that character, paradoxically, is finite as opposed to the unstructured humanity, which was infinite. The human is existent. What does it mean to be existent? That the human exists in a negotiation between a willing being who acts and a being in the world who is subjected to the necessities of the world. And there lies the paradox that on one hand, the human being willfully imagines a totality for himself as a structure. On the other hand, the very act of structuralism reduces and brackets him, limits him within structural contours, and a large amount of existence stays outside it. Is a will to surrender to incompletion, because you have to exclude outside the contours of the structure by which you define yourself. You have to exclude that outside, and that outside is huge. So what is there in the structured definedness of oneself is actually achieved by a subtraction and not by addition, by putting the world or the others outside. And this is some kind of a geological fault, because there is this disruption between the two. There is a fault line between the willing being who is acting as a character, as a man, and the world which is full of others who are excluded from the contours of its structure, or between the self and the non-self. There is a fault line. And this geological fault line is exactly that which causes the character, the defined contour of an individual man, so to say. It causes it to be fallible, because the constitutive fault is in the existent, or is in the character who is negotiating between its will to act as a character and its compulsion to withdraw this particular structure from a large number of non-self realities of the existence. So the possibility of evil is inscribed within the innermost structure of human reality. Man is fallible not in the sense of some religious compulsion, or not in the sense of some mythological burden of guilt, But man is fallible in the sense that there is a disproportion between the human being and his structured formation called character. Man is fallible because there is a discrepancy between the I and the me. Man is fallible because there is a sense of an amount of disproportion between the self that is registering itself as a self and the actual self. A large part of it has been disclaimed in the realm of the others, while the contours were drawn, while the map of the self was drawn. So man is fallible because there is a non-identity with himself. Man is fallible, man is pathetic because there is a non-coincidence with the self. These are the moments of fragility, and these moments of fragility are filled up by such structural devices such as imagination, which is the structural filling up the gaps, by a structural map or contour called character, which is the delimitation of the self as an existent. And another level of fragility is definitely feeling, because a large number of data or information about yourself you cannot directly experience. You have to feel it by interaction with the world that which you excluded from the boundaries of the self. The character is the 0 point of the self's field of orientation, the way the self would like to orient or map itself into a structural totality, into a structural stability. Character is the 0 point of that field of orientation. And happiness is the ultimate infinite end of the self's field of orientation, because happiness is relegated to the infinite, from which only small and disproportionate part is structured into the definition of an individual or definition of a human being. Therefore, man is pathetic. Therefore, man is fallen, because happiness is infinite horizon from every point of view, and the character is actually a structural necessity of the human being to see his self from his own point of view, which is largely, again, the moment it starts looking at itself, incomplete. So there is a phenomenological reduction, and this reduction actually cannot separate the character or man from its others, but at the same time, while resulting a structural stability to the assurance of the self that I have a structure, I have a contour of my existence, that reduction, it cannot separate it from the others, but also it cannot bridge the innermost affects, the innermost feelings and the objects of feelings properly. So there are these let's say, pathological compulsions of the human being. To put the matter once more very, very simply, is that everything has a structure. We have seen in our previous lectures that language is the thing about which the structuralists are giving their several models and propositions, and we can apply that model to any other text which is structured like language. For example, building, or for example, human society. Ricouer was addressing, especially that Ricouer which we have concentrated upon in this brief lecture, on man's structural understanding of himself. And the moment man wants to understand himself, he has to define himself. The moment he wants to define himself, that moment he has to refine himself. And the process of this refining, the process of this separation, the process of this filtering of what will be included in the structural stability of the self, involves a large amount of negations and a large amount of eliminations towards the outside of the self. So lots of actual let's say matrix in which the actual reality in which the human is existing are doomed to be outside the contours of the structural map that man organizes for perceiving or understanding himself. That is why man, or let's say the structural model of existent human, and that is character, is never complete, never free from being beckoned, disturbed by and targeted towards the objects of desire, which are all outside this boundary line or map of the structure of the self that man is making. That means outside himself. And that way, the character is always very, very finite and very, very incomplete. And this is a geological fault line between the self and the other, or let's say man and his world.